We've all heard this story at some point or another.
High taxes make people lazy and relying on handouts. Now low taxes, man, they mean new ventures, man. They mean new jobs. They mean prosperity for all.
World leaders across the world until recently agreed low taxes are the thing. Donald Trump in the US, Liz Truss in the UK, Yoon Suk-yeol in South Korea, Emmanuel Macron in France, Fumio Kishida in Japan. Some soldier on, blessing their countries with untold prosperity. Unfortunately, some have since backed themselves into a corner and had to reverse course. Some have reversed all the way out of office, in fact. Today we dive into the wonderland that is supply-side economics, aka trickle-down economics, aka a rising tide lifts all boats. We'll look at the history of supply-side economics, what good the tax cuts have achieved for you, for your dad, for your nan, for your grandpa. And we'll look at whether we should keep cutting them. But why are so many people banging on about the benefits of tax cuts in the first place? Let's have a look. Now, tax cuts are part of a bigger idea called supply-side economics. In theory, supply-side economics just loves growth, man. We should invest in people's health, in education, in science and technology. We should also cut regulation and taxes so people can build businesses. Everyone and their dog will have their own business. No taxes and no nonsense regulations, no man to keep them down. Why cut taxes, you ask? Because don't you know about the Laffer curve, man? The Laffer curve? The Laffer curve? The Laffer curve? If taxes are too high, everyone will get lazier and start dodging. No money for roads and schools, man. The tax rate needs to be just right, and growth will go to the moon. So the story goes, at least. Now, supply-side economics, guys, claim to be about investing in people and helping them realize their true potential. But in practice, they're mostly really just about tax cuts. And hardcore tax cuts at that. The Institute for Economic Affairs, a prominent UK supply-side think tank that gave us luminaries like Liz Truss, the UK Prime Minister who lasted about as long as a head of lettuce in power. This same Institute for Economic Affairs wants you to pay a 12.5% flat tax above a 10k personal allowance. Now this sounds great, doesn't it? But for reference, that means that shop assistants, nurses, policemen, firefighters all pay more in tax, while executives and solicitors and management consultants get to pay less. And for another reference, this kind of tax policy is on par with Russia and the petrostates, countries where inequality is off the charts and poverty is rampant. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. Let's first have a look at where these ideas came from. Now let's go back to Victorian England. Idyllic country manners, top hats, waistcoats, walking canes everywhere. A better time when people were refined and had manners. They cared about literature, horse riding, and making necklaces out of human hair. A time when taxes were low and any respectable gentleman could build a fortune peddling opium to druggies worldwide. Why pay taxes? They're theft, after all. And as we know, low taxes means new ventures, means new jobs, means prosperity. Just like in good old Britannia. That's what Victorian toffs used to say. Meanwhile, across the good old Britannia, millions of factory workers were either busy shitting themselves to death on sewage-ridden streets and coughing blood on their 15 roommates in the slum when they weren't pulling 16-hour shifts at the local sweatshop. Taxes are theft, the argument went. That was at least until the people of the UK, sick of wealth concentration and wanting pensions, forced the government to introduce the People's Budget in 1909. This budget introduced taxes that increased with land and income, for the first time ever in world history. The government then further jacked up the taxes to fund World War I, and soon after, the British people realized they could now fund schooling and pensions, not the end of the world as the Victorians predicted. But the rich were still rich, and the poor still pretty poor. It took for World War II for all to realize the poor should be made less poor, and tax money should pay for healthcare and social housing. After these changes were introduced by Clement Attlee's government in 1945, growth exploded. Everyone was getting better off, even the rich. The standards of living rose for everyone through the late 40s, 50s, 60s and early 70s. And the party continued for 30 years until the stagflation. Next up, the 70s. Bell bottoms, roller skates and disco music, thick moustaches, chest hair, sweaty Elvis, world leaders aggressively kissing mouth on mouth. But it wasn't just fun and games, because first came the left jab. The US stopped converting dollars to gold at a fixed rate, causing chaos in exchange rates. Speculation went rampant. One day, a dollar could buy a sack of proper British potatoes. The next, it might just be a half a sack. This made importing and exporting a massive headache and increased prices. Then came the right hook. US printing boatloads of cash dollars to fund its humanitarian operation in Vietnam. Then finally came the knockout uppercut. In 1973, oil-producing states like Saudi Arabia stopped exporting oil to the West. This caused a universal shortage and made oil and energy super expensive. The expensive energy, the helicopter money, and the chaos in global logistics caused massive inflation across the Western world while the economies stopped growing. Everyone was getting poorer. And the worst thing about stagflation was no one saw it coming, and nobody knew what to do about it. This put the economic crème de la crème of the time in an embarrassing situation. Now the truth is, the Western world had never had a shock like that. Expensive oil made everything expensive. Heating, food, clothes. It made energy-intensive manufacturing more expensive, causing factories to shut down. The usual tools, price controls, lowering interest rates, more government spending, couldn't help. Only cheaper energy could. But while everyone was busy throwing everything in the kitchen sink of the stagflation, shadowy figures started crawling out the woodwork and championing the gospel of good old 19th century tax cuts. Austria, early 20th century. Snowy mountain peaks, blue lakes, stocky houses covered in flowers, blonde girls dancing merrily. But also a multi-ethnic empire in nationalist unrest. The emperor's son gets murked by Serbian terrorists. The emperor flies off the handle and announces war. Trench warfare ensues. The empire falls, and a famous painter and his buddies rise to power. After they organize death trains and some more warfare, the famous painter and his buddies finally exit, and a communist infestation spreads to the south, north, and east. A few dudes with thick facial hair and cool names, Gottfried Haberler, Fritz Machlup, and Friedrich August von Hayek at the University of Vienna, thought about the big things, like how to run an economy, and were queasy from the roller coaster ride that was the Austrian history in the early 20th century. These mustachioed gentlemen were called the Austrian School of Economics. They observed that big government equals big tyranny, and concluded that everyone should do as they please and everything will work out just fine, apparently forgetting that it was these principles that caused the desperate poverty in Victorian Britain and Great Depression America. Now these prominently four-headed gentlemen were the renegades of the economics community after World War II. Their ideas were seen as outdated and unworkable for many years. But because of the stagflation for which the traditional Keynesian economics, which was in fashion after World War II, didn't have a clear answer, they became the cool kids. Next generation thinkers picked up their ideas and got a bit carried away. Dudes like Milton Friedman, Robert Mundell in the US, and Anthony Fisher in the UK. These guys kept banging on about how high taxes oppress the benevolent entrepreneur and how only low taxes and deregulation will make economy go to the moon. Cash by the boatload for every hard-working entrepreneurial citizen. These second-generation thinkers set up think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs and pushed their way into the US and UK governments in the 80s. Margaret Thatcher, who was in power in the UK at the time, and Ronald Reagan, who was in power in the US, swallowed their ideas hook, bait, and sinker. The 80s. Hawaii shirts, massive lapels, boxy cars, mullets, and the white stuff. In the US, the Reagan administration slashed the income tax rates from 70 to 50% for top earners and capital gains taxes from 37 to 20%. They also deregulated the financial markets, turning bankers from stuffy, boring pencil pushers to swashbuckling yuppies high on profits and nose candy. Transformations like this inspired film characters like Gordon Gekko. And aside from inspiring films, they also led to a long list of financial scandals. There was the savings and loan crisis. In this crisis, the deregulation caused small mortgage providers called thrifts to keep piling on debt, eventually blowing up in a $124 billion unmitigated financial disaster. Then there was also the story of the quadruple Z best, or ZZZZ best. Barry Minkow, a proper bootstrapping American entrepreneur, left school at 16 to build a carpet cleaning business. Now things didn't go too well for Barry at the beginning. He had to pawn off his nan's jewelry and fake business contracts to raise loans and prop up the company. But after a little bit of weaseling, he did manage to take the company public on NASDAQ. At that point, he started living the American dream. Mansions, Ferraris, TV ads, white shirts, bling. Barry was a charming lad and managed to hype up the company value. But this didn't prevent the company from running into serious cash flow problems. So what did Barry do? Of course, the bootstrapping entrepreneur that he was, he decided to change the biz model and set up a Ponzi scheme to prop up the stock price. Now this was a poorly calculated move on the part of Barry, which finally landed him in the slammer, but not before swindling some $100 million from investors. In the UK, meanwhile, Thatcher applied the monkey see, monkey do principle. Her government slashed the income tax rates from 83 to 40% for top earners and the corporation tax from 52 to 35%. She deregulated finance, spawning a new generation of financial cowboys in the UK. It was time to make big dosh in UK finance too. And just like in the US, financial scandals abounded. There was the Barlow-Clowes scandal of 1988, where a chap called Peter Clowes set up a modern, trendy, offshore scheme, promising stratospheric returns on safe and boring UK government bonds. Now, these red flags didn't prevent the investors from handing him over their hard-earned dosh. Peter just turned around and stuffed the cash into his own pockets and even more of it into dodgy deals. He was jailed 4 years later, but not before having defrauded some £140 million from small investors. It took the UK government 23 years to recover the money. It's been 40 years since Reagan and Thatcher fell in love with low taxes. In addition, the collapse of communism in the early 90s made free marketeers look like superheroes. High on snow and sweet, sweet dosh, they kept banging on about something like taxes and tyranny. 40 years later, not much has changed. Taxes all across the developed world are still at about the same level, if not lower, and the situation is even worse in the developing world. The economics establishment keeps parroting that all is well and the rising tide will lift all boats, while standards of living for ordinary folk keep falling. Something feels a little bit off with this story, so I think it's time to look at the track record of lowering taxes. Now first, what are taxes for? Taxes are to fund the good things that everybody likes. Motorways, public transport, schools, hospitals, pensions, fraud prevention, everything that we take for granted today. All of these services are to prevent most of us dying in ditches and slums, just as we did back in the 19th century. Progressive taxes, meaning taxes that are higher on the rich, also even out the playing field and drive down inequality. This gives your kids a chance to do well. For example, taxes help make housing more affordable for your kids. When most wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, only the wealthiest have enough cash to buy assets, especially real estate. At the same time, they influence policy to throttle house building. So what that means is that, if lucky, your kid has to save into his mid-30s to scrape together a deposit on a run-down, mouldy shoebox of a place next to a soggy industrial estate. Meanwhile, Alexander Rupert Cavendish, 23rd Baron Chestbury, is already on his third property off the back of a modest £1 million contribution from his dad. Progressive taxes also prevent the rich getting so rich they can take over the media and government and push for policies that help Alexander Rupert Cavendish, 23rd Baron Chestbury. But do low taxes actually work? Because if they do, who cares? A rising tide does lift all boats, and you're just green with envy, you lazy pleb. Let's examine this. Now let's have a look at Ronnie Reagan's record first. He promised lower taxes would bring unprecedented growth, and government would actually raise more cash to fund stuff like roads because of all this growth. To his credit, he did manage to control the inflation rate, which went down from 12% to 5.4% from 81 to 1989. He also managed to reduce unemployment from 7.5 to 5.4% and achieved relatively decent growth at 3.2% on average. But bringing the inflation down was not because of tax cuts. It was because of tonking high 20% interest rates that his government imposed for a while. All of this growth and employment was actually due to this reduced inflation effect. And even free marketers today agree that tax cuts didn't really help the economy. Even George Bush's economic guy, Greg Mankiw, thought Reagan's advisors were charlatans and lackeys. Tax cuts did, however, help the US government almost double its debt as a fraction of GDP, and also helped increase inequality, making rich Americans even richer while wages for the rest stagnated. Now let's look at Maggie Thatcher's record. Her pitch was pretty much the same. Low taxes, hard graft, great success, kick the lazy off the dole, growth for everyone. She did manage to bring down inflation and get some economic growth. But to be fair, on inflation she just continued the same high interest rate policies that the previous government had introduced. She also made life pretty crap for a lot of low-income earners. there was massive unemployment throughout the 1980s, and entire manufacturing towns across northern England and Wales were completely gutted of all employment opportunity. Now, predictably, these policies that she introduced made the rich even richer, while average income for the bottom 50% barely moved. Now, if you think that Reagan and Thatcher are bad examples and that I'm just cherry picking, we could look at dozens more in different countries across different times. But all of that is noise. There is only one thing that we need to remember. Since the spread of supply-side economics in the 80s, growth has slowed down or stagnated across the developed world. So we've taken a very long trip down memory lane, starting in Victorian England, going on to interwar Britain and Austria. Then we spoke about the beautiful 30 years where the world was developing rapidly, and then the stagflation of the 70s, and the rise of supply-side economics in the 80s, and ended up in the world where we live today. Everything we saw along the way points in one single direction. Low taxes increase government debt, which means that more tax dollars are needed to pay off the interest, and that there's less dosh available for the nice things in life like hospitals and schools. Low taxes also do next to fuck all to spur growth. As we've seen, growth across the world has been lower since the tax-cutting frenzy of the 80s started, and whatever growth there was mostly scooped up by the top 10%. TLDR, tax cuts are just not very good. And if you like this production, consider subscribing and tuning in for more in the future.